Welcome to week 3 lab material. We are covering tissues and skin today in our lab discussion. So this covers pages 12 through 19 in your lab packet. So objectives 12 and the ones that are listed on pages 17 and 18 specifically, those are the terms you need to know for lab. So look at the objectives on page 12 and also the terms on page 17 and 18 objectives in your lab packet to know what you'll be tested on in the lab exam that covers tissues and skin. So I'm going to go into our folder, lab and lecture folders, to find the PowerPoint we're going to work on today. So if we look at the lab folder here, I'm going to go to tissues and skin, and here's the PowerPoint I'm going to go through today. And then also, if I shrink that down for the moment, whoops, that's not going to work. Another document you want to print off and have handy while we're going through today is this one, the lab notes. Always print off the lab notes and the lab PowerPoint when we go through lab material, because this has all the written descriptions of the lab objectives from your lab packet. If I take a look at this, I can see what I have shown on page 12 in your lab book is this table, and it's completely filled out here for you. So you definitely want to have these lab notes handy, because that way you don't have to write every single thing down that I say. You can just refer to this document and highlight things that I might be saying when we're discussing things in lab. So be sure to have this document right alongside your PowerPoint as we go through every lab this semester. There's always going to be PowerPoint pictures, and there's always going to be this set of lab notes that are basically what you see in your lab book on pages 12 through 19, but all the spaces are filled in. So we'll put that down, and then we're going to go to our PowerPoint here to discuss today's topics. So looking at lab 3, starting with the tissues on page 12. Epithelial tissues are the first 3 tissues listed in your table on page 12. We classify them as epithelial because they are tissues that typically cover and line the body, organs or body cavities. So this first tissue is called simple squamous epithelium, and all epithelial tissues have a 2-name system to them. The first name typically tells us how many layers of cells are involved. The term simple means 1 layer of cells. So a simple squamous epithelium has 1 layer of cells. Squamous, the second name of epithelial cells, tells us the shape of those cells. So squamous is a flattened, or think of it as squashed, flattened cells. So simple squamous means we have 1 layer of flattened cells. If you look in your textbook on page 89, it describes how we classify epithelial tissues. It'll show you that the first name is based on the number of cell layers, so it's either going to be simple or stratified, and the second name is based on cell shape. Again, we're looking at page 89 in your textbook. So the shapes shown on page 89 are squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. So in this case, this particular slide is showing a tissue of simple squamous epithelium. Each one of these cells that are lining the air sacs of the lung, this is a tissue of the air sacs in the lung, which are called alveoli. So here's the air sac. The lining of this air sac is single cells touching end to end to form this air sac. So that's characteristic of a simple squamous epithelium. Very thin layer of cells, 1 layer, flattened cells for rapid diffusion. We find these these line the capillary walls, so we can have rapid diffusion of things from blood to tissues, and we find these in the lungs, where we have rapid diffusion of gases from the lungs to the blood. Stratified squamous epithelium, that first name tells us we have many layers of cells. The squamous tells us again we have flattened cells or squashed cells. This is a tissue, again it's an epithelial tissue, and we find these in areas where we might see a lot of friction or abrasion. For example, when you swallow a bite of chunky pizza, that's going to scratch the sides of your esophagus, but because we have stratified squamous epithelium lining your esophagus, If we wear away a couple of layers of cells, there's plenty more below it to replace it. So stratified squamous is very protective. It can slough off the surface and not do damage. We also find stratified squamous on the surface of our skin. That's another location. As our clothes rub against our body, or our shoes rub against our feet, or as we move around in our chair, we are sloughing off some skin cells, but because there's many layers below it, we don't have to worry about doing damage. So there's more than one location for each of these tissues. For the lab exam, you only need to list one location. So I wouldn't expect you to know every location for these tissues. Just know one that makes most sense to you. For example, if the skin, because we know our skin sloughs off, we know we have dandruff, a little bit of flakiness on our skin, if that makes more sense to you as being a tissue location for stratified squamous epithelium, then just learn skin. You don't have to remember esophagus, mouth, vagina. Just remember skin. Just choose one for the lab exam. Another one, it's not listed here, I apologize, but it's simple columnar epithelium. And I'll go through and find it online real quick. I need to add a slide to our, we need to add a slide to our PowerPoint with this simple columnar epithelium. So what I'm going to do is just find a slide online real quick and show you that. So simple columnar. Here's a nice, maybe not. There's a nice picture of simple columnar epithelium. Here we can see it's simple, which means we have one layer of cells. Columnar meaning we have tall, column-shaped cells. So even though there's other cells below it, the tissue type we're zeroing in on is this portion right here. So just focus in on where the arrow is pointing, or if we have a slide, we'll make sure you can identify which part of that slide we want you to look at. So this is simple columnar epithelium. And this is a classic tissue that lines the digestive tract. Once we get past the esophagus and we're in the stomach, small and large intestine, we find simple columnar epithelium. So we can absorb and secrete substances from the digestive tract or into the digestive tract. We have these large cells with lots of different functions, and you'll learn more details on their functions when you get to general and advanced A&P if you have to take those courses. So again, simple columnar epithelium found lining the digestive tract. So going back to our PowerPoint, the next one is areolar or loose connective tissue. If you like the word loose over areolar, that's fine. You can just call it loose connective tissue. Again, both are listed in your lab packet on page 12, so you choose whichever one is easier for you to remember. This tissue is classified as a connective tissue, which means it's usually found below an epithelial tissue. And we can see here that it's just below the epithelial tissue here of the skin. So we find areolar or loose tissue beneath the skin. We find it wrapped around organs, lots of different areas below the mucous membranes, lots of different locations. It's modified mucous membrane, but you'll get into that maybe in more detail in future courses. But for right now, just think of it as the body's packing peanuts, which means it wraps around our organs, provides some cushion, some absorption ability for excess fluid that might leak out of the blood, and also underneath our skin. So the key characteristic of this type of tissue is, look at these elastic fibers. It almost looks like black hairs that have gotten under the microscope. These give this tissue some elasticity. Also, the pink that you see in the background, those are collagen fibers. In some slides we have on campus here and under the microscopes, these collagen fibers have pretty much dried up and we don't see too many of them anymore. All that will remain are these elastic fibers and the dark nuclei of the fibroblasts that make the elastic fibers and the collagen. So looking for these black hair-like structures on the slide is really characteristic of that areolar or loose connective tissue. Again, found underneath the skin or packaging around the organs. The next tissue is adipose. Adipose tissue, another name for that is fat. So we find fat also underneath the skin, scattered among the areolar or loose tissue. We also find fat tissue. And this looks very uniform in thickness as far as the edge of these cells. We're looking at a plasma membrane here of each individual cell. So we have this plasma membrane that forms each individual fat cell. So here's a fat cell, here's another fat cell, there's another fat cell. So this kind of looks like chicken wire. Cells are relatively uniform in shape, but they're not always perfectly round like this. They definitely have different views to them, but they are thin-walled cells because the nuclei has been pushed to the edge because of the large fat droplet inside of each cell. So think of chicken wire when you look at adipose tissue, because it's very uniform in appearance, lots of large open cells. Again, it's a connective tissue. It's found underneath the skin, and we also find more of it in the breasts of the adult female. Compact bone or osseous tissue is found in our bones, on the margins of the bones where we see solid bone tissue. There's different types of bone, so be sure that you don't just call this tissue bone. Be sure you call it compact or osseous bone, because that's the specific type of bone it is. What's characteristic about this tissue is that we see these tree trunks or target-like looking structures. That's definitely unique and characteristic of osseous or compact bone. The next one is another connective tissue. It's hyaline cartilage. What's unique about hyaline cartilage is that it has this fisheye soup appearance. If we look at these cells, the dark nuclei surrounded by these open spaces, and then this pink matrix that they produce, it looks like fisheye soup. So again, fisheye soup is characteristic of hyaline cartilage, and it's a connective tissue. Where we find it is in the nose, the trachea, the larynx, and the cartilage that attaches the ribs to the sternum. So here we can see the ribs, and here's the sternum. So what's shown in red here is the cartilage that attaches the ribs to the sternum. That gives our rib cage some flexibility, so when we inhale and exhale, it doesn't require that much muscular effort because there's some cartilage that allows those ribs to move inward and outward more easily. The next tissue is classified in a category all by itself. The classification is muscle, because there's different types of muscle. There's smooth muscle, heart muscle, and skeletal muscle. So we're specifically focusing on today skeletal muscle. And these are cells that are long and cylindrical, and they have these vertical stripes or striations. That's very unique to skeletal muscle, are the striations and these long parallel cells lying side by side next to one another. So this is characteristic of skeletal muscle. Look for that striped appearance of these cells. And where we find skeletal muscle specifically is attached to bones. Sometimes we say skin, like we can wrinkle our forehead because of a muscle that's not attached to bone, but it's attached more to our skin to give that wrinkle in your forehead. But regardless, it helps us move. It helps us move a specific body part, where smooth muscle doesn't really move a body part necessarily. It more moves substances through our blood or through our digestive tract or out of the uterus. And the heart muscle causes our heart to beat, but specifically skeletal muscle causes movement, and it's attached to bones. Nervous tissue is a unique tissue that we have these large star-like looking cells. These are called neurons, nerve cells, with these long processes coming off, and those processes allow for the transmission of electrical impulses with nervous activity. Where we find nervous tissue is in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Again, you don't have to know all three of those, just pick one for the lab exam. So nervous tissue, again, you're looking for these large cells. Now we're going to go to Dropbox. Dropbox is a place online that if you would like extra views of tissues and things from lab, you can go there and look for extra resources for lab. So I'm going to go to Dropbox. Actually, I can do it a little easier by going down here. And if you go to Dropbox, you want to click on, it'll ask you to sign in. Maybe I should do that first. I apologize. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go this way. I'm going to go and open up a new folder, or a new browser. It's www.dropbox.com, and I'm going to sign in under my email, and you can use my email. You have to use my email. It's carj@westerntc.edu, and the password is Anatomy Lab, ANATOMYLAB, all one word. Sign in, and it's going to take me to this list of folders that I put out here for you guys to use. So if we go down to Tissues and Skin, open up this folder, and I go to Tissues FAP. FAP means Fundamentals of A&P. GAP means General A&P. Well, we don't want to go into General because we're still in Fundamentals, so we'll click on this one. Oh, okay, maybe we won't. Okay, we're going to go to Tissues in General A&P. I guess I didn't update that yet. There's an extra tissue in here we don't want to look at, but I'm just going to review some tissues here and see how well you can remember the names of these tissues. So we'll start with this one. This first tissue is adipose. This tissue, do you remember what it is? You can pause and look it up, and I'll tell you the answer. It is areolar tissue. This tissue is compact bone. This tissue is compact bone. This tissue is compact bone. These tissues, this pink tissue here, we're going to skip. That's a general A&P tissue. This pink tissue here, we're going to skip. It's a general A&P tissue. And this one, we're also going to skip. That's a general A&P tissue. You don't need to know that yet. But this one looks like the fisheye soup. And the fisheye soup we know as Hyaline Cartilage. This one, this tissue, again, also Hyaline Cartilage. Another one, Hyaline Cartilage. Yet another picture, Hyaline Cartilage. And here's another nice picture, Hyaline Cartilage. Here's an example of that large star-shaped cell with a bunch of smaller cells in the background. This is classic of nervous tissue. Here we can see lots of open spaces. We can see cells that line these open spaces. Again, individual cells forming the open spaces. So this is characteristic of simple squamous epithelium. I'm sorry, I'm trying to quiet my phone down here. I don't know why it's continuing to be noisy here. Okay, so this is simple squamous epithelium. And this last one here is again simple squamous epithelium, single layer of flattened cells. This tissue is skeletal muscle. Another slide of skeletal muscle. Yet another slide of skeletal muscle. Here's a nice big picture of skeletal muscle. Again, notice the striations, these vertical lines going up and down. Here's another large picture of skeletal muscle. Again, the characteristic feature of skeletal muscle is the vertical lines, the striations. Yet another picture of skeletal muscle. This one's a little lighter in color, but again we can see those striations showing up very nicely. Again, that's skeletal muscle. Here's another slide of skeletal muscle. This slide we can see contains many layers of flattened cells. Do you remember what that tissue is called? Hopefully you said stratified squamous epithelium. That's correct. Here's another slide of stratified squamous epithelium. Here we see it lining the esophagus. Can you see the open space in the center? And then we have these many layers of cells on the outside. Again, stratified squamous epithelium. They don't look very flattened here because there's nothing in the esophagus, but these are more flattened cells, and we would see that better if there was a bolus of food moving through that esophagus. Another example of stratified squamous epithelium. Many layers of flattened cells. So these are just some resources for you to look at on Dropbox.com to give you more pictures, things to look at from lab. So now we'll continue on with the skin in our next lab video.